In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. So we pick up again with Orthodoxy 101. And today we're going to talk about an interesting subject and a very disjointed subject, if you want to call it that. And we're going to be talking about cultures and traditions in the church. Now, for many people who come into the Orthodox Church, they are attracted by many different traditions and cultures in the church, so much so that they lose track of why they're really becoming Orthodox or what the deeper underpinnings are of these different traditions that really become sort of kind of their focus. You know, they like the way they dress, or they like the music, or they like the style, or whatever it may be. So we have to sometimes separate them out from the church, not in the sense that they're not part of the church, but to put them into their proper perspective, which is why we are doing them and how that leads us to Christ. Because if we looked for the traditions in themselves, then we're missing the point of what it is that the church is trying to do with these. And again, because the church is so very much multi-ethnic, uh, spreads a whole different, vast amount of cultures from Eastern Europe, Asia, uh, Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere. And then many of these sort of traditions get brought over to wherever the Orthodox Church is planted. For example, in North America, people see that as that is the correct way, or that is the right way, or they want to recreate their own cultural world um, in this new place that they are. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I would think about my own background. You know, my great grandfather, who came from Slovakia right after World War One, and left his wife had died, and but he left his two children there, my grandmother and her sister, and they sort of lived in with their relatives. One of them a bishop, who eventually helped them come over, and when he came to America, you know, he found the like people, and so they wanted to create that particular culture because they were so different than other people. And you know, they had different celebrations of Christmas, because they were on the old calendar. They had different celebrations of Easter. Um, they spoke a different language. They had different rituals. So many of those things made them very much outsiders into wherever they were planted. In my case, it was in northern New Jersey. And so many of these people gathered together and they formed these communities. And these communities, in many ways, reflected back to what they had left behind in the old country. And so for many of them, the church became the chaplain of the culture. And in some cases, that was very good. Um, but in other cases, what happened is as generations went on, you know, you had second generation, third generation, fourth generation, you had people intermarrying with people from other ethnic backgrounds. And many of those cultural traditions, which had great meaning for the first and second generation, lost their effect as the generations went on. You know, by the time, you know, I came around, you know, we knew a few words. We had some food that we ate. We knew there were certain traditions that we did. For example, for around Easter or on Christmas Eve with the Holy Supper and things of that nature, and many of those things became very much part of our lives, but they didn't have the same meaning that they may have had, say, a couple of generations before me. And this is true in many other cultures, whether who are traditionally Orthodox. They all kind of brought over their things. There is a Greek word, horiati, which is kind of like village customs. It means, you know, the people who are the horiati, they bring over their customs of their village, they transplant them in a particular place, And over time, that becomes more important than the church itself. So we always have to be a little bit cautious when we approach these ideas of culture and traditions with a small t. I'll explain that in a second, and realize what it is that's happening here. And for people who come outside of those cultures, maybe people who are converting into Orthodoxy, some of them are attracted by that, but some are also repelled by those cultures because it has absolutely no meaning to them. And so we can't ever make that the main reason for the existence of the church to be that chaplain of that culture. But nonetheless, some of those are important and good and actually holy. And so we have to kind of keep those within our proper perspective as we look through this. And we're going to go through not a lot, but we're going to go through some varied things in which I'm going to try to make points on certain things. And just remember that none of this is necessarily the foundations of the church, but they are aspects of church life. And so if you find yourself in a church that tries to keep all these different traditions, understand what it is that's happening. And also note that in many parishes now in the OCA, they are multicultural. They have a mixture of all different people from all different backgrounds. In my parish in Las Vegas, for example, I had 15 different ethnic groups, all of them with different cultural traditions and things of that nature. And I had to learn about these. I had to understand them because I was expected to honor them in a particular way. And we try to do that as best we can. The other point I would make is that there's also another type of culture, and that's the culture of the North American convert into the church. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of them come from many different backgrounds. Some, for example, Protestant backgrounds or Roman Catholic backgrounds or whatever that may be, or no background at all, basically an American. And that is a culture in itself. People forget that. They bring their own particular perspectives, traditions, cultures, things of that nature into the church. And not only do those need to be honored, but they also need to be put in a proper perspective. And so don't forget that some of these parishes, for example, that we call quote unquote convert parishes, they were all converts who all came into the church. Um, some of the things that they do are very alien to people who are, shall we say, traditionally Orthodox in their upbringing. And they walk into these, they say, well, this is not how I understand church. So it goes both ways. It's converts coming into a traditionally, shall we say, ethnic parish, but it's also an ethnic Orthodox coming into a convert parish. They both have their kind of perspectives, and they both need to be kind of honored, but also understand that that's not the main thing. Very often you hear say, well, we're going to do things really, really Orthodox. We're going to be really Orthodox in how we do that. And of course, as my one bishop would say, well, when do you mean that? Do you mean that 17th century Orthodox? Do you mean 4th century Orthodox? Do you mean 1st century Orthodox? Do you mean 20th century Orthodox? Do you mean Russia or this? So there's a lot of different things that get fed into there. And all of a sudden, you're kind of confronted with this, and then in some cases, even made to choose which one of your definitions of Orthodox we have. I would have to say that the Orthodox Church in America has very ably and systematically addressed this in the sense that they recognize this from the beginning. And this is part of like Father Alexander Schmemann and recognizing, this type of unique situation that we have in the church, and this unique setting that we have this church. As I remind people, particularly in my seminary courses I teach, we are a kind of a unique situation here. We're the only Orthodox church, I'm talking about the OCA, in the entire history of Orthodoxy up until the present moment, that is a minority church in a country that is democratic, secular, and that we are not answerable either to a government or a foreign patriarch. We're it. That's it. We're the first ones probably in the history of the Orthodox Church who is trying to make this work. So there's been a lot of lessons learned about this. And Um, Other churches that are kind of growing in parts of Europe, et cetera, are looking to the OCA and saying, how are you doing? How are you dealing with these type of situations? You know, how do you work this out? Because our experiment of orthodoxy in America is actually has far greater impact than perhaps our size does in the Orthodox world. And so that's something we should be very, very thankful for, but something we should be very conscious. So when we have issues that come up in the church, and we do have issues that come up in the church, one of the things we have to say is it's our issue and we're going to deal with it in our way, understanding that we're going to deal with it in an orthodox way. And so these are type of things that we're looking at, and we're really trying to say, okay, so what is the issue here? I have another story. I remember there was a particular family who became Orthodox, and uh, they kept saying to me, "Well, Father, we need to make this an American church. We need to make this an American church." And I kept asking, "Well, tell me what an American church looks like." Because we don't know yet. We're still working through that. What is an American church going to look like? I certainly have some ideas about that. Certainly, may have some perceptions about it. Certainly, the OCA has deep Slavic roots. So many of the things that we do, the style of vestments, the style of music, other things, are definitely more of a Russian or Slavic sort of style, except for some of our ethnic dioceses. But I don't know if we know what an American church is going to look like yet. I think it's a developing thing. I know they tried one time to make the eight tones. Go back to an earlier class on what the eight tones were, and they tried to make an American set of eight tones, and they used "Ode to Joy" and they used different hymns, and it really didn't work. It didn't work at all. And but it was an attempt. And I remember leading this person into the church one day, and I kind of turned to him and said, "Here's an American church. We have this kind of tapestry of all these people, not in some cases a melting pot, all coming together and being, kind of forming together a parish community, but in other ways, a tapestry in which all these things are beautifully intertwined with each other, and that we honor all of them and hope and pray and consciously try not to make sure that not one overshadows the other. But again, we're still working this out. In Russia, when it took them 200 years to finally get autocephaly or self-governance from the church in Constantinople. And all during that time, the Russian church was developing its own sort of style and cultural aspects of the church that it took time. And so we've been autocephalous for 50 years. We've been in North America for 200 years. We're still trying to figure it out. And so whatever we do have and whatever we are trying to work through, it's an honest attempt, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think the future will tell us where we will go. Um, so anyway, that's kind of like as an introduction into this very interesting topic. I wanted to start with talking a little bit about the two types of tradition with a big T and tradition with a little t. I have a whole class on tradition with the big T. You can look at it's like the second or third class in the series, so you can go back to that and to really understand it. But um, tradition can be misconstrued and misunderstood. What we mean by tradition with the big T is that life of the Holy Spirit that's passed down from generation to generation within the church. So everything kind of flows out of that. The Bible came out of the holy tradition, the church services, the iconography, the theology of the church, the dogma of the church. That teachings that we believe in all came out of that holy tradition. It's the source of everything. But tradition with a little t is much more like, what are we doing in this particular context? At this time and in this place with these people, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And how is the faith being made alive through that? And so we have to remember that it is a living faith. Yaroslav Pelikan, who he was a professor at Yale and was a Lutheran, and wrote extensively on patristics and eventually became Orthodox before he died, wrote, and this was in a Jefferson lecture in 1983, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I suppose I should add, it is traditionalism that gives tradition such a bad name. So, in other words, when we look talking about tradition, it's a living thing that brings us to Christ. But if we're talking about traditionalism, in other words, being the chaplain of the culture, then it can lead us to a sort of dead faith. And so we have to always be careful of that. And John Chrysostom even says, we have to consider the tradition of the church trustworthy. Because if we don't see it as trustworthy, then it's not something that's leading us to Christ. So when we look at these different things, and I'm going to try to bring out some that are trustworthy, shall we say, we have to understand that what it is to lead us to Christ. We hold all the traditions of the church, written and unwritten, and above all to the most mystical and sacred celebration and communion and assembly, whereby all other rites are made perfect. That's from a letter to Dionysius from St. John Chrysostom. So what he's talking about there is, what we are talking about here, we hold fast to them, both written and unwritten, because in some cases there are unwritten traditions. We're going to celebrate, for example, the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple. And that's not necessarily scriptural in the biblical sense, but it is part of that unwritten tradition of the church. So there are all those different things that we have. So anyway, and this will probably be the only time in this class, these series, that you'll hear me quote Losky. He's this great theologian who was incredibly dense. I mean, you read Losky and you're just, there's actually a funny cartoon about the ladder of divine ascent of people kind of delving into Orthodox theology, beginning with, kind of the lower level, Kallistos, where Shmemen, and it goes up and deeper and deeper. And the last one, and you see this person sitting exhausted, is over Losky because it's so hard to understand. It's incredible, but it's very dense. But Losky wrote about this tradition with a small t. In the article, Tradition and Traditions, the image in his book, The Image and Likeness of God, which is a classic sort of modern theological book. He calls it, there are two types. There's the vertical tradition, God to man, and that's what we talk about, tradition with the big T. Things that are handed down from God into man, and that's good and right and holy and what we do. And then there's a horizontal sort of tradition. He says it's kind of like the apostles to men, that it's something that is spread throughout the church and continues to spread outward. And it's not a dead letter, but it's a living word. And it can only be attained in the church through the initiation into the sacraments and made manifest by the saints in history. The methodology is the key, according to Losky. And so, in other words, what he is saying there is that, all these things come from a good and right and proper place. And if you are immersed in the church life, and if you're immersed in the Eucharistic, the sacramental life of the church, then all these other little traditions that are out there will make sense. And they will be put in proper perspective. But if you're not, then it can lead you astray. So again, so we have to be careful of that. And so anyway, so with that being said, let's pick up a few of these. I'm going to start with the very easiest one that we have, the one that everyone who is Orthodox need to know, because it is an important part, and that's how to do the sign of the cross. Now, you wouldn't think that's a tradition with a small t, but it is. In the Orthodox Church, we do the sign of the cross. We take the right hand and we take these three fingers and we put them together. Then we have these two fingers down here. So what does that mean? This means Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And these two mean Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man. So this is an important part. This is a theological statement. Now, in the early church, they did it like this because they believed that you only blessed yourself with Christ, who is the man, fully God, fully man, the incarnate Christ, not the Trinity. And that was actually a huge debate. And in Russia, that actually led to a schism. You hear about called the Old Believers. They split over how to do the sign of the cross. They took this deadly serious. And there are some old believer communities that still exist. There's one in Erie, Pennsylvania. There's a couple of other ones, and then they were kind of wiped out by the czars, but there are these groups. In fact, they've become so much that they've lost the priesthood, they've lost their lineage, and they have all sorts of interesting sort of things. So we have the sign of the cross, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We touch our forehead, bless our mind. We touch our breast, bless our heart. And then in the Orthodox tradition, we always go to the right. Whereas in the Roman Catholic, they go left. And we always go to the right, to the two shoulders, right? And then the left. That's because in the Orthodox tradition, we always do everything to the right. Right is the hand of blessing. That's why I wear my wedding ring, which is a Orthodox tradition. We always wear the wedding ring on our right hand. And that is because in the Bible, the right hand is the hand of blessing. And it says very clearly in the scripture, put the ring on his right finger. And so, again, that's sort of that tradition of the church. And boy, that's a conversation piece. People say, why do you have your wedding ring on your right hand? Because that's the tradition in the church. And so when I marry someone, I place it on their right hand. And there's a whole sort of ritual that goes around that. And what they do afterwards, is up to them. But in the Orthodox tradition with a small t, you wear your wedding ring on your right hand. You do the sign of the cross like this. You're going to go to the right and then to the left. Now, some people will go and they'll touch the ground. That's a sign of humility. Some people will go before an icon and do the sign of the cross 3 times. Sometimes they'll go to the cross and do a full prostration and touch their head to the ground as a sign of humility. These are all traditions in the church. Some of them are cultural, some from different regions in the Mediterranean as opposed to Russia. The key point in all of this is to do the sign of the cross attentively and correctly. Not the little, we used to call them the banjo, you kind of go like this, but really take the time. Don't go be like someone, I go to Russia and see these old babas and go, they make this huge sign of the cross and they make this big thing, and make this big flourish of touching the ground. Just do it properly and correctly and understand what you're doing, particularly in how you're holding your fingers, because that's a theological statement that we are making. So you can see that interplay between a tradition, a cultural thing, shall we say, and the more critical part is, what is it telling us? How is it leading us to Christ? So that's one of the ones that is kind of the easiest one to do. Another one that's very controversial in the church is head coverings. The Apostle Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 11:5 about women wearing head coverings. And so for many people coming into the church and they read that and they look around and they become very fixated on this idea of head coverings. And my answer to them is always the same, if that makes you feel closer to God, then by all means do that. But remember that this is also a cultural thing. For example, in Russia, that's very much a tradition to wear a head covering, for women to wear head coverings in church. And I know when, for example, my wife and I would travel to Russia, you just don't enter a church without a head covering. It's just part of that tradition. However, here in the United States, it's not necessarily a tradition. But you may have other traditions. For example, for many Greeks, they don't wear the head coverings until they're a widow. Or they may, in certain Ethiopian, Eritrean traditions, they don't wear a head covering until the women have reached a certain age. In other cases, in the Middle East, for example, they don't wear hair coverings until they are married. So again, it all has these different traditions in there. And you have to respect them, that those that come from those particular cultural backgrounds. But it doesn't mean you appropriate them and make them and say, this is the right way. In Alaska, for example, the tradition is that the women actually make these, I guess the best word I could describe them is like a doily. And they have these beautiful ribbons and they decorate it. And it's a very much a part of their tribal and village pride, that the women have, and there's a certain style for each village, and the women would wear these on their head, and it's a beautiful and pious tradition. I would not ever impose that on someone because it's not our tradition; it's their tradition. And if someone does that and comes into the church, and we honor that tradition, and so I think that's one of those things that we have to kind of always be careful with. And head coverings can become a huge debate within the church. It should not be. It should not be. So, some other traditions. There are certain things, for example, certain feast days that are more important than others. For example, in the Ethiopian Eritrean community, the Feast of Theophany, they call it Timkut, is an incredibly important feast day. That is commemorating the baptism of Christ. In fact, they have this huge celebration. They carry this tabernacle, which is a representation of the Ark of the Covenant. By tradition, Ethiopia has the Ark of the Covenant in one of its churches, and they carry this, and there's a huge thing. And then actually, um, the people would, at the end of the service, would jump into this huge pools of water. Very pious tradition, and one that we should, we try to honor. In the Serbian tradition, they have this thing called a Slava. A Slava is, they don't necessarily have it where each person has a name of a saint. Instead, what they have is they have a family saint, and that family saint's been handed down from generation to generation. And so when that Saint's Day happens, then the family gathers together. They bring the priest. He has a service with bread and wine and a way of cutting it and turning it and offering prayers for the family. And it's a good and holy and pious tradition. Now, I would not impose that Serbian tradition of a Slava on any other person, but those people who have that tradition in their background, well, you certainly want to honor that. Again, it's a good and pious thing. Um, Other different things that you'll notice in the in traditions. For example, we'll take some of these are kind of, for example, in the Carpatho-Russian Ukrainian tradition, on the night on Christmas Eve, there is a tradition of the Holy Supper. The Holy Supper is when you come together before the service. You have 12 courses, all fasting courses of meat and etc. and different types of fish. You started off eating a garlic to remember the sort of tough times in the day. You have honey with a special type of bread. You remember the sweet. You have the 12 courses. You have these prayers that you do. And it's a good and pious tradition amongst, the Carpatho-Russian Ukrainian people. And by the way, each region has their own, what dish should be done. Again, these are good and good things. In the Greek tradition, on St. Basil's Day, which is New Year's Day, January 1st, they have the Vasalopita. It's literally the St. Basil bread. And there's a whole tradition about blessing the Vasalopita. And inside there's a coin. And whoever gets the coin is supposed to have a blessing for the year. So again, you honor that. In Serbian tradition, they have also the tradition of the Yule Log that they will bring in and place on Christmas Eve. And then they'll spread straw on the floor. Again, a beautiful tradition for the Serbian people. In the Russian tradition, you have the baskets on Easter night. You bring these baskets with all these different types of foods, in which you've been fasting from during Great Lent, basically meats and cheeses, and you'll have different kibasi, and you'll have horseradish with beets and all sorts of different things. And the priest will bless these baskets, and then the people break the fast together and eat all these wonderful delicacies. Again, a good and pious tradition within the church. And I know I used to chuckle because we had that tradition in Montana, but then I had all these people who came from many different backgrounds, and they kind of, I had these people who were ranchers or were outdoorsmen, so they would bring in venison and pheasant and all sorts of different things, elk meat, buffalo meat. That's good. It was one of these things that we took it and we made it part of who we were, and so that's a good and proper thing that they have. One of the traditions in the Orthodox Church, which is fairly universal, is on the Feast of Theophany. After the water is blessed, the priest that has between Theophany and the beginning of Great Lent, he goes to every house in the parish and he blesses the house with holy water. And during that time, you read prayers for the new year, for the upcoming year. You remember the living and departed, and you spend time with each family. It's a very practical thing. It's a way to visit each family in their home. It's a beautiful tradition of the church, and I encourage people when they become Orthodox, or that get your house blessed each year. It's a wonderful way to kind of keep that that wonderful spirit going. Um, Other things that you may notice are different styles of vestments. That's one that people immediately notice. There's a Russian style, which is basically the high back. And then there's the Greek style, which is basically the low back, which is interesting because the high back originally came from Mount Athos and was brought up to Russia. but nonetheless, it became known as the Russian style vestments. They're both perfectly fine. They both have all the same sort of things. They just have different styles. I wear mostly the Russian style because that's what I grew up with. That's what I'm used to. Um, Even the colors of the vestments are really a tradition of the church. In the rubrics, it only says dark and light. Wear your dark vestments or wear your light vestments. But over time, this sort of became more and more spread out. So certain colors became associated with certain seasons of the year. For example, there's the gold is your standard color. That's your everyday normal. If you don't have anything else, you always have gold. Um, and then you have from gold, you have red, and red is usually for the Christmas fast. It's also in Russia, red is used for Pascha, whereas in the West, mostly white is used for the Paschal period. Again, different traditions in that. Red is also to represent the blood of the martyrs. It's also has other different things. You actually have it listed out in the books. Blue is for any feast of the Theotokos. Green is the color for the feast of Pentecost. That's interesting, by the way, because it becomes from an Old Testament uh, understanding of what Pentecost, which was the feast of the booths, and they would actually have the booths set up with these greens, and so green became the color of the Holy Spirit. So when you remember sainted monks and stuff, you wear green. Um, you have white, which is the Paschal color, but it's also in some places that's where it's worn on Christmas. You have, or on other certain things, you have purple, which is the color for Lent, which is supposed to be the royal color. The most expensive dye is purple. Only the kings and the royalty wore purple, born to the purple. You've heard that term. So you have purple. In some cases, that this was a more newer one, is black came into the church, which is usually during Holy Week. Everything is switched to black. Though some traditions have where they'll wear black during the week of Lent and purple on the weekends. Then you have other traditions where you wear purple during the week and then you wear gold or red on the weekends. Kind of lighten up the color because you kind of go out of this liturgically out of Lent for a little bit and then back into it each Saturday and Sunday. So again, these are all different traditions within the church, and then you'll find different fabrics and different styles as well. So again, don't get uh, wrapped up in it. It's a beautiful part of the church life. I just switched all the cloths over to red in the church for the Advent, for the Nativity fast, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to have that sort of tradition. In many Orthodox traditions in other countries, they don't have that kind of rotation of colors of vestments. They stick to the light and dark, and so they'll wear whatever they want, basically. Some parishes can't afford to have different colors. So again, these are important things, and there are important parts of the church. There are immediately recognizable for many traditions may be the style of music. The Byzantine chant versus the Russian four-part, what they call royal court chant or obikud. Different styles of music, Middle Eastern chanting, Middle Eastern style music, Romanian style, Alaskan style. All these things are good. I know the OCA tries to incorporate all of this, but basically, if you have our normal musical styles, it's basically the obikud. It's the Russian court chant. Because and it's much easier, I think, for American ears to hear because it's four-part harmony. It's based on basic European styles of music, as opposed to the Byzantine chant, which is much more different, beautiful in its own right. But again, you may go to two Orthodox churches, two different styles of chant, just like you can look at the iconography and you can tell that, yeah, this is a Kievan style, bright colors. This is a Moscow style, more reduced colors. This is a Byzantine style, all good. Coptic style. I mean, I have, they're not in here. I turned over here to my icons corner here. You can see there's all different styles of icons here. All have, all good and all proper. And as long as they fit within that overall sort of rules of what icons are. So you have those wonderful things that you have. Church buildings are another one. In Russia, you have the onion dome. You have that very typical onion dome. They even the different number of domes. One dome represents God, two domes, the two natures of Christ, three domes, the Trinity, four domes is the four Gospels, five are what's the five? I forget. The seven, the seven sacraments, the nine ranks of angels. So there's all different styles of that. Um, and you can even tell because a Russian style church is probably much more closed in and higher. Think about practical sense, keeping heat in and stuff. Whereas a Byzantine is much more open, much more flowing. Um, Again, you go into the church, you can absolutely recognize it's an Orthodox church. You just may have a different style. You have a Serbian style, you have a Georgian style. These kind of develop within their own countries and their own cultures. And again, that's good and that's right. And we haven't developed necessarily an American style. Many of them are either one way or another. But again, we're working through that sort of thing. And you'll even see different crosses. For example, the three-bar cross is definitely a Russian style cross. It represents the three-bar cross. The top bar represents the nameplate Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. The longer bar underneath it represents Christ's arms out raised, and the slanted one represents that the thief on the right confessed when Christ was crucified. The thief on the right confessed, so he went to heaven, as Christ said, "You will be with me in heaven." And the thief on the other side did not, and he went in the other direction. And so that's the Russian style cross. The Greek style may have the budded cross, has three little buds on each of the four sides. There's an Ethiopian style cross, which is much more fancy. There's an Armenian style cross, which has its own sort of beautiful symmetry. And again, these are all different styles of cross. They're all good. They're all proper. They're all holy. They're just different styles within the church. And again, they came out of the culture, just like the domes. The Byzantine style domes as opposed to the Russian style domes. Again, they're all good. They're all right. Some in the Russian tradition, a lot of the iconostases may be very high and go up with many, many icons. In the Greek style, they may be very low and much more open. Again, all good. Another sort of, I'm just going through my little list here. Vestments, music, crosses, baskets. Some traditions in the sacraments we can go into, and then I'm going to get into something a little bit deeper on that. But there are different traditions on how you do the sacraments. I remember I had a group of Moldovians. Moldovians are kind of Romanians, but not. And there was a tradition in the Moldovan church that when you did a baptism, you brought the priest a towel. Okay. So I have a whole stack of towels that, like not necessarily bath towels, but actually fancy, beautiful towel that you would use like on the beach, like a beach towel. And the tradition was you always presented the priest with a beach towel. So I have a bunch of beach towels. It's good, it's proper. In a Greek tradition, for example, in baptism, they would lather the child with olive oil. So it's always tradition that you bring the priest a bottle of olive oil for him to use in the baptism. I just did a baptism last week, and they had a Greek background. They brought me a beautiful bottle of olive oil to use for the baptism. In some traditions, the Greek they'll bring you soap too. So after the baptism, you wash your hands in the baptismal font, the priest with the soap. It's a pious tradition. Some people have thrown coins in it. That's kind of a little strange, but the kids have to fish the coins out of the baptismal font. In some traditions in the Orthodox Church, for example, before we go on that, one of the traditions, which is a very important one in the church, is when you come to communion, where you put your hands over, cross, your right hand over your left one, and you open your mouth when you come to communion. And the reason for that is so that you don't grab for the chalice or upset the chalice, but it's kind of keeping you in a particular position, and then you open your mouth and the priest will place communion in your mouth. So, and again, it's not necessarily a dogma of the church to do that, but it is a practical way in which you approach the chalice. In weddings, for example, there's all sorts of traditions. In the Russian tradition, the crown would be a very beautiful, sort of stylized crown in which the person would, the best man and the maid of honor would hold the crown over the couple. In the Greek tradition, it may be beautiful flowers or wreath or some sort of thing that actually sits on their head with a ribbon that goes between them. And rather than the priest blessing the crowns, the kumbara or the best man would do the blessing, would do the exchange of the crowns. Again, a good and pious tradition that you have in the church. In some cases, in some traditions, someone from the family will make a beautiful rug for the bride and groom to stand on. They did that for my wedding. We still have it. It's beautiful. It's framed, beautifully made rug that you stand on that rug for the wedding. Again, a good and right and proper tradition. Burials also have its own set of traditions, which are interesting as well. In some Orthodox traditions, mostly Russian traditions, you actually have a shroud that you will place over the body. And the shroud is an imitation of the shroud that we take out on Holy Friday and is placed in the tomb in the church and then taken out. It's an imitation of that. And there's actually a whole part of the service where the shroud is then placed up over the body. In some Russian traditions, the body will get a paper crown or a cloth crown, which is Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us. So they're now crowned as they die. Again, a good and proper and right and holy tradition. And there's a Greek tradition. I saw this firsthand in Jerusalem. These Greek women would come, and there's the stone in the front of the sepulchre where Christ's body laid. And every so often, a priest would or deacon would come and he would spread holy water, and these women would place a plain white burial shroud on this cloth, on this rock, this marble slab with the holy water, and then they would fold it up and they would use that for their burial shroud when they died. So again, these are good and pious traditions that they have in the church. I'm trying to think of some other ones related to burial. I've done Gypsy Romani burials, and that's a whole other sort of interesting polyglot of traditions that are brought into the church. So the point being is that you could see that there's all these different types of ways in which the church manifests itself, and the faith manifests itself in a sort of this cultural way. The final couple things I want to talk about, which in some ways is tradition in the church, and the first one is on fasting. So, there are the rules of the fasting in the church, and normally and traditionally, the church, and this goes back way back even to the Shepherd of Hermes and other early patristic sources, which predate the Bible, by the way. They actually predate the Bible. The Didache is one of the first of these, and it talks about, means the two ways, and it actually talks about how Christians fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Whereas the Jews would fast on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the Christians fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. And the reason, because Wednesday is the day of betrayal and Friday is the day of crucifixion. So very common within the church, you fast on Wednesdays and you fast on Fridays in the normal course of the year. And then there are the special fasting days. You have the 4 fasting periods. You have the Nativity fast. You have the Great Lent. You have the Apostles fast, and you have the Dormition fast. And then you have certain days in which you have what's called a strict fast. For example, the beheading of John the Baptist, or the Feast of the Elevation of the Cross. Holy Friday, which is the strict fast day. We're not supposed to eat anything from sunrise to sunset, and other sorts of things. But how those fasts manifest themselves, we've talked about these before, is interesting, because there are different rules in this based off of the monastic, which the monastics are vegetarians to begin with. And so there are certain days when you may be allowed fish or wine or olive oil, because those are considered luxury. And you'll see those marked, on the liturgical calendar, fish and wine and oil day or whatever. When we mean fasting, we normally mean abstaining from meat, your basic stuff, your beef, your pork, your chicken, your lamb, that type of stuff. But lobster is always good, by the way, because it's a fish without a backbone. So go figure that. Lobster, clams, all that stuff is always good because that stuff you can just sort of collect. But there's the dairy fast. Some people, some Orthodox traditions keep that very strictly. That when it means a fast day, it means no dairy products, no eggs, no milk, any of that stuff. Others say no, that's allowed, but only on certain days or however it may be. The best thing to do is, first off, do the best that you can. Um, Always try to increase it. Fasting is something that takes time to develop. And talk to your priest. I mean, here's a very good example of a tradition on fasting that is something that is uniquely American. We have Thanksgiving coming up. Thanksgiving falls within the new calendar, the revised Julian calendar, always falls within the fasting period of the Nativity fast. So what do? Some people keep it. They don't do the Thanksgiving turkey and all those other sort of things. But some people and then bishops have said this. You know what? This is a tradition in the church. It's a tradition in the society that we live in. The Feast of Thanksgiving is a good feast, giving thanksgiving to God. Um, and so, therefore, it is good and proper that you can, for that day, go ahead and have Thanksgiving. Try not to have any leftovers. Try to eat, for that day, the fasting requirement is lifted. You're not going to get an official statement on that, but again, you ask your priest, and the priest will kind of direct you on that. But again, it's something that's uniquely American, and I know in the OCA it's pretty widespread that's how the fasting is done. Um, so again, these are different ways in which they're made manifest. The final thing I wanted to just spend a few minutes on, and it may seem kind of strange that this is what we call a tradition with a small t in the church, because it is rooted in canons and scripture and other sort of things. But how it's actually practiced necessarily is something that's more local, and that is the governance of the church, the hierarchy of the church, and how it's sort of set up. We hear of different, metropolitans, patriarchs, archbishops, bishops, archpriests, and all those sort of things. They all have different sort of titles. So the OCA definitely follows more of a Russian style on this, but it does have a kind of a unique sort of way in which it governs itself. Even within America, the different jurisdictions have different ways in which they govern themselves. And if we start at the lowest level, you have the parish, and the parish has a priest, and a priest is assigned to that parish. There's no such thing as a freelance priest. You're assigned to a particular altar. Actually, technically, you're assigned to an altar. And that priest can serve there for his entire life or for a short time. There's no necessarily tradition on that. A difference between a priest and an archpriest is basically the seniority. An archpriest is someone who reaches a certain level of seniority in the church and is given the dignity of the archpriest. He may stand ahead of him in the line of seniority when you line up, but really there's no difference between a priest and an archpriest. This likewise with a bishop and an archbishop in the Russian tradition, there is no tradition, there's no difference. An archbishop is not in charge of a bunch of bishops. In fact, it's very simply put, a bishop and an archbishop, the difference is seniority. So you're a bishop for a certain number of years, and after a certain number of years of seniority, you'll be made an archbishop. The difference comes with a metropolitan, who is the first among equals. So he is kind of the senior bishop, kind of the president of the synod, the president of the board. He doesn't necessarily have power directly over a bishop. In other words, each bishop is sovereign within their own diocese, but the metropolitan is sort of the coordinator of all those dioceses. And a metropolitan has his own diocese in which to care for. So technically, a metropolitan cannot step foot into another bishop's diocese unless he's invited by that bishop. And the metropolitan is the title because by the metropolia is the capital city. So our metropolitan Tikhon is the Archbishop of Washington and Metropolitan of all America and Canada. In other words, his see is the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. Makes sense. And then he has a synod of bishops in which all the bishops of the diocese sit on in order to make decisions and to govern the church. And he presides over that synod. Um, Bishops may have auxiliary bishops, they're assistants. They'll be given every bishop has a city, has a see. So it's usually a capital city or a historic city. So you have in our diocese, Archbishop of New York, Michael, in other words, New York City, and the Diocese of New York and New Jersey. In New England, the diocese, it's Boston is the see. In the Midwest, it's Chicago. In Eastern Pennsylvania, it's Philadelphia. In Western Pennsylvania, it's Pittsburgh. In the South, it's Dallas. In the West, it's San Francisco. In Alaska, it's Sitka, because that's the historic see. In Canada, it's Ottawa. In Mexico, it's Mexico City. And so you could see each of them has a major city, which is their see, in other words, the place in which they preside, over a diocese, which is a geographical region. And then for the ethnic dioceses that we have, the Albanian, Bulgarian, Romanian, because they kind of spread the rebel out, they may be given a see. So the Romanians are in Detroit because there were a lot of Romanians there. The Albanians were given the seat of Boston because there were a lot of Albanians there, and the Bulgarians were given their cathedrals in Toledo because of the number of Bulgarians that settled there. So again, so these are the different sees. And so you'll see different jurisdictions. For example, in Boston, you'll have a Greek bishop of Boston, the OCA bishop of Boston. New York, you have a whole bunch of different bishops from the different jurisdictions. Canonically, that's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be one bishop, one city. But because of the anomaly of the United States, it kind of gets a little confusing on that. So you'll have a patriarch, by the way, is someone who is an ancient see. So like our metropolitan would be the equivalent of a patriarch, but because we're a newer church, we don't get the title of patriarch. Russia didn't have the title of patriarch until much later. And so these are kind of ancient sees, and they have the same function as the head of the church, like our metropolitan does. So each bishop has a diocese, and each diocese is therefore then divided into what we call deaneries. And deaneries may be a specific region or cluster of parishes. For example, in the Diocese of New York and New Jersey, we have 3 deaneries. We have the New York State Deanery, we have New York City Deanery, which extends out to Long Island, and then we have New Jersey Deanery. In the South, you'll have the Florida Deanery, you have a whole bunch of different deaneries. In Eastern Pennsylvania, you'll have different groups of deaneries. And the deanery is head by a dean. And the dean is a senior priest who is elected by his fellow priests or selected by the bishop, depending on how they want to do it. And he is responsible for that particular area for the bishop. He acts on behalf of the bishop in this particular region. So very often the dean will be your first person who go through, has issues that need to be dealt with in a parish. Sometimes he'll do the negotiations for the parish's package, the parish priest package. Normally deaneries meet together on a regular basis. They discuss certain issues. They'll vote on certain issues. They'll have services together, things of that nature. And so that's really what a deanery is. So for example, Wappingers Falls, where I'm at now, we are actually in the New Jersey Deanery because the New York State Deanery pretty much is all upstate New York, and we're kind of not that far up, so it's closer for us to get to New Jersey. So that's why we're in that particular deanery. Some deaneries, like in the West, they created a missionary deanery. So all mission parishes were placed in one deanery, and as they grew to the level of parish status, then they were placed in their geographical deanery. Again, that's totally up to the bishop. And the bishop usually has a council of deans. So when the bishop will have a meeting, it's just to deal with clergy and pastoral matters. He'll gather his deans together with the chancellor. The chancellor in the diocese is the senior priest of the diocese, and kind of acts on behalf of the bishop and does basically whatever the bishop needs to be done. But canonically, a chancellor is, if the bishop dies, then the chancellor is supposed to take over all of the bishop's property and make sure the property of the church is transferred to the new bishop. And he has a lot of responsibilities in kind of keeping the diocese running, because the diocese is called widowed when a bishop dies until a new bishop is elected. And we'll get into that in a second about the election of a bishop. So anyway, so they have a deanery, you have a diocese, you have a church. In the Greek tradition, by the way, metropolitan and archbishop is reversed. A metropolitan is a senior bishop, and an archbishop is the presiding bishop for whatever reason. It's just one of those cultural things that worked out the particular way it did. And even the election of a bishop, as I alluded to, is done in many different ways. For example, in Russia, when the patriarch is elected, particularly Tikhon, they actually did it by lots. They voted on a set of 3 bishops that they felt were worthy for the title. They placed their names into a chalice. A monk who was known for his holiness would come and pick a name out, and there it is. There's the next patriarch. That's how Tikhon was elected patriarch of Moscow in 1917. In other traditions, it would be a gathering of clergy who would elect a bishop or a metropolitan. In other cases, the synod. In all cases, the synod has to confirm it. So nothing can be elected without the synod's confirmation. And there have been times where a bishop was elected, but the synod did not confirm that person and chose someone else. But in the OCA, we've taken what we call the 1917 council, which was held in Russia during the revolution, which kind of changed the way the church governance. It fell apart because of the Russian Revolution, but many of the delegates were from the United States and brought that system to the United States, where it survived in the OCA. So, for example, when we elect a bishop, what you do is you have a gathering of 1 clergyman and 1 layperson from each parish in that particular diocese, or in the case of the OCA, from all the parishes in the OCA. And then there's, for monastic institutions and seminaries and other things, they all have their delegates. If you have 2 priests assigned to the parish and you have 2 lay delegates, etc. And they will gather together, and after a series of prayers, you will vote secret ballot. The ballots are counted. I've done this 3 times. Wait, I did Jonah, Tikhon. So twice I had to kind of run the election of the metropolitan, and it's counted up. If the person gets 2/3 of the vote, if one person, that name is sent to the synod for confirmation. And if the synod confirms, then that person is made the metropolitan or a bishop. If the synod does not, they send it back, and if they don't confirm that one who got the 2/3 vote with a reason why, and the vote would happen again. If you do not get 2/3 vote, it goes to a second round, and the 2 names that get the highest number of votes are sent to the bishops, the synod, and the synod then selects from there who will be the bishop. So in some cases, the one who got the highest votes was not selected. It was another candidate. In other cases, the person who had the highest number of votes, the bishop selected. So again, we may elect a bishop, but really the synod selects the bishops. But that's an interesting way. Again, there are different traditions. In the Greek Archdiocese, for example, names may be recommended to the Holy Synod in Constantinople, but in the end, it's the Patriarch of Constantinople who selects who will be the bishop, in consultation with his fellow bishops that sit on the synod. In Russia, for example, you have many bishops. So they're actually where the metropolitan has a particular region with bishops underneath him, and those metropolitans sit on a special synod with the patriarch. So there's a number of key sort of metropolia. It's just a way of organizing things. So again, these are part of the tradition. Nothing necessarily tells you how they are to be done. It's just this is the way in which they develop within these particular regions. The Serbians have their own way. I think they did lots at the last one. They actually selected by lot who would be the next patriarch of Serbia. So there's all different traditions. Alexandria has their own tradition, etc. All good, all proper, all ways in which they're done. So I hope we're going to end here. I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. And again, I told you it was going to be eclectic, that they have all different ways in which these things are sort of manifest in the church. But it gives you a sense of not only the breadth and the depth of the church, but also how it all kind of fits together. Again, these are good things. They're proper things. They lead us to God, hopefully, but they're not in themselves important for our salvation. And I think that's an important point. What is important for our salvation is how we utilize these things so that we can find God. And so that's where we go back to what Yaroslav Pelikan said. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. What we have to always make sure is what we do is part of our living faith, part of what's bringing us to God, that's part of which is revealing God, part of which is what the beauty of the Orthodox Church. And when we have that within ourselves, my brothers and sisters, then God's radiance shines forth through his church, through his customs, through all these things. They all become important. They all become a way in which we discover the truth of the Orthodox. So have a blessed evening. We won't have class next week because it's Thanksgiving, but we'll pick up the week after that, and we're going to do a class on specifically the Virgin Mary. We're going to cover a whole hour of just talking about the Virgin Mary and the Theotokos. So have a blessed day.